In the winter of 1932, the Ukrainian countryside was gripped by a horror unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Villages that had once been prosperous farming communities were now filled with the starving dead. Mothers who had watched their children die of hunger now had to bury them in shallow graves. And all the while, Soviet officials were confiscating every last grain of wheat, leaving the peasants to starve. This was not a natural famine. This was a man-made genocide, the Holodomor. The word means death by hunger. And between 1932 and 1933, an estimated 4 million people died in Ukraine alone. Joseph Stalin's policy of forced collectivization had become a weapon of mass destruction. This is the story of Stalin's man-made Holocaust. Before the famine, Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Its fertile black soil produced vast quantities of wheat, rye, and barley. The Ukrainian peasants, known as kulaks, were among the most productive farmers in the world. They lived in villages and worked the land with traditional methods. But to Joseph Stalin, they were a threat. They were independent, prosperous, and resistant to Soviet control. They had to be eliminated. Stalin's policy of collectivization required peasants to give up their private farms and join collective farms called kolkhozy. The peasants resisted. They slaughtered their livestock rather than hand them over. In response, Stalin declared war on the Ukrainian peasantry. He called them kulaks and branded them as enemies of the state. In 1932, he ordered Soviet officials to confiscate all grain from the Ukrainian villages. The grain was taken, and the peasants were left with nothing. They were not allowed to keep enough grain to survive the winter. They were not allowed to leave their villages to search for food. They were trapped. And they were starving. The Soviet regime had created a famine. In 1932, a report from the Ukrainian capital of Kharkiv stated that 4.1 million peasants were starving in the countryside. The famine spread quickly. The peasants died by the millions. They died of starvation, of disease, of exposure. The dead were buried in mass graves. The survivors were traumatized. The Soviet Union tried to hide the famine. They refused to accept foreign aid. They denied that a famine existed. But the evidence was overwhelming. In 1933, the Ukrainian government reported that 3.5 million people had died in the famine. The Holodomor was a genocide. It was the deliberate mass murder of a people through starvation. Stalin's regime had targeted the Ukrainians because they were considered a threat to Soviet power. The famine was a weapon, and the Ukrainian people were its victims. An estimated 4 million Ukrainians died in the famine. The genetic potential of the Ukrainian nation was broken beyond remedy. The dead were buried in mass graves. There were too many bodies to bury individually. The survivors were left to mourn their dead. The Holodomor left a scar on Ukraine that has never fully healed. The famine did not end until 1933, but the damage had been done. Ukraine would never forget. The Soviet regime continued to deny the famine for decades, but the truth could not be hidden forever. Today, the Holodomor is recognized as a genocide by the Ukrainian government and by dozens of other countries. In 2008, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law officially recognizing the Holodomor as an act of genocide against the Ukrainian people. The memory of the Holodomor is a central part of Ukrainian national identity. It is a reminder of the suffering of the Ukrainian people and their resilience in the face of oppression. Every year, on the fourth Sunday of November, Ukraine commemorates the Holodomor. People light candles and place flowers at memorials. They remember the millions who died. The Holodomor Remembrance Day is a time for reflection and mourning. It is a time to honor the victims and to ensure that they are never forgotten. Here is the question that remains: why did the world allow the Holodomor to happen? The Soviet Union denied it. The world ignored it. The Holodomor was a crime against humanity, and it was a crime that was never punished. But the Ukrainian people have survived. They have rebuilt their nation. And they will never forget the Holodomor.